I won't pretend it's not frustrating and that sometimes it doesn't take its toll. But one of the big messages of my book that has been really helpful to me personally is that I really understand what I'm writing about, not to be an individual issue, but to be a systemic problem. And I understand that women being overworked, women being underpaid, and the kind of total devaluation of their labor, the criticism of them, the backlash against them is driven not by like any one single person or idea or like men versus women, even, but rather these broader structural
Mhm.
incentives.
Hello and welcome back. I have been waiting for this interview for about 3 years. Her research and really everything that she does has me drooling over here on this side of the United States. Now, my guest today is Stefanie O'Connell. She is an award-winning journalist, someone who has been writing about money, stories of corporate America, and she's also a mother. So, Stefanie O'Connell, welcome to the show. How are you?
I'm well. Thank you for having me on.
Thank you for being here. Here is her book. I've been taking notes. So I started this podcast because I was denied access to financial advice, not once, but twice. And then being told that financial planners don't help my demographics. So what inspired you to start researching the ambition penalty? What is your story?
I will just say stories like yours are my inspiration. I have reported on personal finance for a really long time. And when we talk about money, there is often this idea that if you just follow these steps, you will get these outcomes no matter what. And what I saw increasingly was that you could follow the exact same advice, but your outcomes would shift dramatically depending on your identity. Not because you were doing something differently as a person of that identity, but because of the way the world responded differently to you as the person of a different identity doing the same behavior. This is particularly true in workplace settings. A big focus of this book and a lot of my work is pay negotiations, for example. There has long been this idea that women don't ask for more, or they're not confident enough, or they don't speak up, or they don't assert themselves. But what I found when I looked into the research was that when women did those very things, not only were they not as likely to receive the same outcomes as their male peers, but they were also more likely to be penalized, to be scrutinized, to be judged, to be labeled difficult or not a good fit or selfish or not a team player. And it really made me interrogate not just gender double standards, but double standards across so many identity metrics, from gender to race to class to sexuality. And what I wanted to do was kind of unpack those intersections of identity in this book and expose them for what they are so that we could have more honest conversations about the barriers to our opportunities, because a lot of the conversations we have around barriers to opportunity assume that we are the problem individually, that we are doing something differently. And this book really kind of exposes the fallacy of that.
Thank you for that. And I think your book exposes more than what we just covered. So I'm going to keep asking you questions because I primarily serve Latina women, and we have been sold this narrative of the American dream is access to education, and we
Mm.
fight hard for that access, applying for a student loan and reaching out to people. And so, in a sense, we have been taught do it right and then you will have financial freedom, or check all the boxes as high achieving Latinas and then everything is going to be right. But one of the things that really stood out to me, you also talk about the unpaid labor that women do. Do you mind touching a little bit on that?
Oh, yes. There is so much to dig into, and even just what you said about how, like, this isn't just about people who engage in the same behaviors having different results. It's also about unpacking these bigger ideas of the American dream or meritocracy, or if you just become educated or work hard enough, then you can kind of out hustle your way out of inequality or racism or sexism or anything else. But a big piece, an under discussed piece, in my opinion, of this is the factor of unpaid labor. And for Latina women specifically, some of the highest rates of inequality within the home in terms of housework and childcare. And I think a lot of people are now starting to become familiar with the fact that household inequality is a big issue. But I don't think we've really connected the dots between how much household inequality upholds inequality outside of the home and how much what we see in terms of labor force participation gaps, of promotion gaps, of pay gaps are a direct result of men not stepping up to care for children as equal partners and not stepping up to deal with household labor or mental labor or emotional labor. So one of the things I dug into was really showing how this kind of household division of labor is not about choices, is not about even income, because we see in households where women earn more money, they still are tasked with the vast majority of unpaid care work and household labor. It's not about job flexibility, even when men have more flexible jobs, and by and large they do not step up and take on an equitable share of labor. And it's not about all these other reasons we pretend it makes sense that women do more. It is because the share of household labor that women are tasked with is so unsustainable, it keeps them from accessing equal financial power and opportunity. And we will not be able to get equal financial power and opportunity without addressing this piece of the equation.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. You mentioned that when a woman enters the job, the entry level, and all the way her journey to becoming an executive, she has to go through 17 performance review cycles versus a man that only goes through 8 performance review cycles. Can you touch on that?
Yeah, so that is a paper that basically did a workplace simulation of a typical kind of corporate pyramid structure. And you've got like the entry level, you've got management, you have kind of like upper management, and then you have the C suite. And what they did is they kind of controlled for everything you could possibly control for: when people start, their performance, how much they negotiate. And all they did was enter in a small amount of bias. I think in that paper, it's like a 3 undervaluation. It's somewhere between 1 and 5%. So, very small amount of bias, even holding everything else the same. And found that with that small bias, compounded over time, compounded over the course of, let's say, a 30, 40-year career path from the entry level to the C suite, if you're a guy, for women who never get there, that small amount of bias grows so much more exponentially, such that a woman, and that's just one intersection of bias, that's not even including any other intersections of bias, such that a woman has to prove herself so much more over and above the standard that her male peer does just to access the next level. And I think that is really indicative of the research throughout this book, right? This is kind of showing how it would work to introduce a small amount of bias and just show, like, you don't need to say, I don't want to hire her because she's a woman, or I don't want to promote her because she's a woman of color, to exclude people. All you need is to say, I just feel like she's not a team player. And you have enough people doing that every single day of their careers, or telling the women who assert themselves in the same way their male peers do that they're kind of too difficult, or undervaluing their contributions to the company, or attributing their contributions to someone else, or assuming they're not competent, or assuming that they're not committed because they're mothers. Like, all of these kind of little microaggressions, a small amount creates such enormous difference in access and in opportunity. And I think it's really important that when we talk about bias, we're not talking about an isolated instance. We're not talking about a bad person. We're talking about a system that compounds over time, every single day of a person's career, and the ways in which their identity intersects with the expectations of a work environment, and expectations about who should have power in that work environment and who should succeed in that work environment, which unfortunately has not changed, as I argue in this book, as much as we think it has.
Yes. And I see so many organizations that are quote unquote promoting a positive work culture. But as you were speaking, it made me realize how much of that it's really being accounted for, especially with, industries like technology, hospitality, and all of these industry where women really want to advance, but they don't have the allies or the leadership that can say, hey, I will sponsor you, right? Especially with the Latino community, we are over mentor and under sponsor. I do want to share with you a real personal experience. When I was in corporate America and I wanted to make it to management, I was told that I was too young to be taken serious. But when I became a mother, I was also labeled a problem and someone who was being difficult and complicated because now I wanted to set boundaries, boundaries that I had to learn the hard way. And in your book, you also talk about ageism and how that disproportionately affects women in the workflow. Have
Yeah.
you personally been affected by it, or your friends, or how does that look like for you?
Oh my goodness. Yes. I mean, I am, by the time this comes out, I might be 40. My birthday's coming up. I'm 39. But I'm short. And so I am someone who has always been perceived as very young. And I've been dismissed because I am perceived as very young. And I remember feeling that way. I remember being hired for things and kind of being taken aside into rooms and by people like questioning whether I was the right person. Like I was really here for this job and kind of interrogating me. And it was weird because these were like older men in positions of power kind of like taking me into these private rooms to like grill me. And it was bizarre. And someone in a position of power could have really abused it. And thankfully, like, I love proving people wrong, and it has really served me in my career. But when you're kind of coming in with that already initial skepticism, you're already having to clear so much higher a hurdle relative to your peer. And I will say, I'm a privileged person, right? Like by every other metric, I have every advantage. And yet still there is this barrier relative to my male peers that I am kind of like having to prove I'm even allowed to be in the room. And so if you're starting from that point, instead of the assumption of being like, oh, you belong here and then we'll see how much higher you can go, it's a completely different starting point. And so I think one of the things to your point about the ageism and like going from being perceived as too young to suddenly like, well, now you're a mom. So there's another really fabulous paper that I write about in the book where, again, people were not explicit about saying we're not going to promote her because she's a woman.
Mhm.
They would say, well, we can't promote her because like she's too young to be seen as a leader. But if she were older, she was seen as too old to be perceived as a leader. And then a young man, the same age as the young woman, was perceived as that's just the guy we need on our team because he represents the next generation. And we really need fresh new perspective on our team. And that older gentleman, we need him too because he's really an experienced, seasoned leader. And that's really what we need. And so it really just exposes how it's not the age, it's the sexism. And in this paper, they found 30 different aspects of a woman's identity that were weaponized against women through these kinds of double standards, where what was seen as a liability for women was seen as an asset for men. So we just spoke about age as an example. You spoke about parenthood status, for example. It's another fabulous example. Becoming a parent is saying that you're not committed to your careers. Meanwhile, for men, it signals the exact opposite. It signals more support from employers, more opportunity, more promotions, more pay. So the problem isn't parenthood. The problem is sexism. Race, again, double standards weaponized against women. Physical attractiveness, weight. I mean, 30 different identity characteristics that intersect with gender identity were weaponized against women and used to support men. And so I think what we have really kind of misunderstood in conversations around gender equity is this idea that we've come so far, and this idea that just because something isn't explicit doesn't mean it's not happening. And I actually would argue that in many ways, because gender bias has been so much more effectively hidden and because it's so much less blatant and public, it winds up being able to spread much more effectively.
Yes. Now you touch on identity, and as you were talking about these first generation Latinas, and I will include myself there, we have this sense of wanting to belong, right? We want to belong
Mhm.
at the table in corporate. We want to belong in the C-suite, which is super difficult to reach. And so some of us have done crazy things. For example, in my case, when I was in management, I used to wear black suits to be seen more respectable. A lot of Latinas, want to show their identity at work, but they also seen like I cannot show up with my red lipstick or even my cultural maybe logos because that might be seen as less capable. And throughout your book, you interview so many women from different industries, and identity was something that kept coming a lot with those conversations. Did you see any patterns that women in general have when it comes to identity at the workplace?
I think you're spot on about how there is this idea that if you kind of conform to a standard of what a leader looks like, and that idea is inherently shaped by incredibly old white male standards. But there's this idea that if you conform, you could kind of bypass the judgment or the pitfalls of being kind of seen as an outsider. And to some extent, there's a reality there, right? If you do it, it's really easy to say, who cares what other people think? Just do what you want. But at the end of the day, if your access to a paycheck depends on caring what other people think, and it does, then that's not really helpful advice for people. So, what I'm trying to do here is kind of expose like there are real incentives to kind of try to conform with these standards of professionalism, even as, yes, they are incredibly problematic. But also, like, if you are kind of pushing the limits of that, and as someone who has gained more privileges in the workplace, that's where I see my role is like taking the privileges I have and using that to take some risks that push the boundaries that hopefully create change. And I think that's an important piece of the conversation. I do think there is something to be said about being able to show up as yourself and being able to perform better and being able to be fully embodied. But those are risks. And I think we shouldn't pretend that they're not. You are likely to be kind of tokenized. You are likely, it's really interesting to talk about how these kind of gender dynamics intersect with other identity characteristics. When I interviewed Black women, there was like this idea that they're going to be stereotyped as being the angry Black woman in a workplace and therefore discredited for being seen as angry. And when
Yes.
I spoke to Latina women, it was like, oh, I'm gonna be seen as like of course, just a fiery Latina. Like it's such a racialized and gendered stereotype that really doesn't come from any kind of reality, but rather like pop culture. Everyone gets angry, everyone gets animated.
Yes.
Like these are not you know exclusive to any single identity, but there is such a tendency to kind of categorize and stereotype. And those are the things that are holding us back, not the behaviors or that we have for ourselves, not how we're dressing, not how we're behaving, for the most part. Like, of course, there are certain standards of behavior and everything that are not great. But the fact is, like, those don't really change meaningfully across identity. What changes is the kind of perception and the judgment of those behaviors.
One of the things that I do with my community is I don't teach cut expenses. I don't teach any of the traditional white male dominant personal finance of frugality and cutting expenses. But I do teach them, hey, we have to earn more, not through hustle, but
Mhm.
actually using the skills that we have. But my Latina clients are so focused on, if I want to earn more, I need to go get another degree. If I have a bachelor's, I have to go get my master's. If I have a master's, I have to get a PhD. Throughout the work that you have been doing, have you noticed that women tend to lean into education as a way to earning more? And are we lying to women when it comes to just get another degree?
So it is very complicated because, as I spoke about before, there's that initial incredulity, already that skepticism of, do you even belong here? And so, to an extent, women are responding logically, especially women of color who are doubly underestimated, because it says, you can't question me. I have a master's. I have a PhD. I have every single qualification. But by the same token, the research also shows us that that is not protection in and of itself of being discriminated against. So it's both. It's both that having those added degrees, is some form of protection. It does get you more credentials to your name in a way that you can point to and say, I belong here, but it will not in and of itself like spare you from the consequences of discrimination. So it's very, very difficult. And I think when we're talking about lasting change, we really have I do think like thinking about what we're doing is so important, but we really need to focus on the environments around us and building kind of resilience through community and not just individually, because individually this is exhausting. I mean, as I'm just kind of recounting the research to you, it's exhausting to me, and I've been talking about it for 5 years, right? It's just like, oh my gosh, this is so demoralizing, it's so exhausting. And the only way to make that more sustainable is when you're in community with other people, and when you're talking about these things and you're sharing your experiences, and then you can create better frameworks of accountability for the environments around you, because it's really hard when you're just doing it alone and trying to ask harder or get on that hamster wheel of like more degrees, more qualifications, more experience.
Mhm.
Like there's only so many hours in a day and you're already carrying more than enough. At some point, we're going to have to really start to bring our focus somewhere else.
One of the things that I love about you is that you are very educated, but first of all, you are very approachable. You have done your research. And as you mentioned, you have been doing this for so long. So I want to bring it back to you as an individual. How do you keep up with the internet trolls that are always just out there telling you that you hate men?
Yes.
Because it's hard, especially as a woman that you are, as someone who's talking to a woman and you're trying to dismantle the system. How do you keep up with this? Like,
Yeah, I mean, I won't pretend it's not frustrating and that sometimes it doesn't take its toll. But one of the big messages of my book that has been really helpful to me personally is that I really understand what I'm writing about, not to be an individual issue, but to be a systemic problem. And I understand that women being overworked, women being underpaid, and the kind of total devaluation of their labor, the criticism of them, the backlash against them is driven not by like any one single person or idea or like men versus women, even, but rather these broader structural
Mhm.
incentives. Structural incentives that say men are the ones who should have power, who should lead, who should have access to resources and opportunity, and women should serve them essentially, who should be submissive. And so when you understand that a lot of this bias, a lot of this discrimination, a lot of these backlash and negative responses are driven by those larger forces, then the problem is never men as a social class. And it's not even, I give even like the individual men a lot more grace maybe than I should. Because at the end of the day, we're all kind of responding to a system. We're all women also partake in backlash against other ambitious women. They also uphold these oppressive structures of patriarchy. Even if they're part of the so-called out group, right? They will too kind of police other women or subjugate them. And so I think I don't hate men. I hate patriarchy. I hate systems of supremacy. I hate unnatural hierarchies that kind of pit people against each other who should actually be in community and should actually be realizing their shared interests. And I do think it's wrong to kind of exploit people and pretend that like that's okay. That's what I'm very clear about. So when someone misunderstands me or wants to attack me for calling that out, I really do recognize that as someone who really doesn't understand what I'm speaking about. And of course, like I'm frustrated that like I'm not communicating clearly enough then for those people, but I think there's also people who just don't want to understand because they benefit from the system as it is. And so I can't like change that. If
yes.
I can't make somebody care if they don't want to care. Actually, household inequality is a really great example of this. You have women like banging their heads against the wall, being like, I made him a list 100 times. I've asked him to help me more and more. What am I doing wrong? And like at the end of the day, you can't make somebody value your labor or respect your time who doesn't want to. And that's very hard to accept. And so that is kind of like where I'm coming from when I get this kind of backlash and when I get criticized. Like, it's hard to accept, but I do understand it. And one of the other things that's really helpful to me is because anti feminists sentiment is so strong right now, you really start to see the when you're attacked at scale, just the volume of comments. It's so clear that there's like a total lack of imagination. These people aren't really thinking critically about what I'm saying at all. They all just kind of come up with the exact same excuses or attacks. It's like they have some kind of like internet forum somewhere where they just are like, here's how we're going to hate women today on the internet. And so when you just kind of see that they're all copying and pasting the same thing, you're just like, okay, here we go again. And it kind of rolls off your back, which is nice.
Yeah, and thank you for sharing that. I wanted to share that with you because a while ago, I was interviewed on my identity as a Latina for, the things that I did in corporate to appear less Latina, essentially. And
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to be transparent and I wanted to share my live experience. And I got so many men that were, I mean, they were calling me all kinds of things. And I was like, wow, like, I'm just like a little person over here trying to educate people on
Yes.
finances, generational wealth. But I think for me personally, that was a lesson of you can be likable by everyone. Just, you just have to move on. And when possible, just mute the comments. So thank you for sharing that. I wanted to bring you back to that because I really value your research and your expertise as someone who I found you scrolling through the internet. Literally, that's how I came across you. And so I like seeing the audacity. I like seeing the research. I like seeing that you are educated. And I also like seeing that you talk to everyone, right? Not just white women. Like you actually talk about like all of us as a collective. Were you wanting to say that?
I wanted to add one of the things that's also very helpful, and I hope that if anyone else is kind of facing backlash, it will be helpful for them too, is to remember like, what is the person trying to attack you trying to do? They're trying to make you stop saying truth to power. They are trying to make you be silent, to make sure that your mistreatment, that the way you've been undervalued, that the way you've been overworked is not shared or exposed. And that does not serve anybody. So I think whenever I'm kind of thinking about the kind of backlash I'm facing, I'm or an argument that I'm like, something about this doesn't feel right. I always come back to, who is this really serving? And that really brings me a sense of clarity. And I do think like I understand the way I talk about things can be very direct in a way that makes people uncomfortable. Like when I talk about household inequality, like I'm saying the data makes it very clear that women across every identity and every income level are being exploited in their homes. And that makes people uncomfortable. And hey, it makes me uncomfortable too. But the problem isn't me saying that. The problem is the fact that it's happening. So I think we always like, I think a lot of the urgency around these inequities has kind of been stripped away. If you talk about a racial pay gap, if you talk about a gender pay gap, people are like, oh, okay, here we go again. Heard this before. Like they're so desensitized to it because like we have kind of come to this bizarre complacency with it. Like we should not be comfortable with the fact that, mothers are so drastically underpaid, even as they are the ones who are basically providing for their families, who are providing the
Yeah.
vast majority of childcare. 45% of mothers in the United States are breadwinners for their family financially as well. So like the well-being of American families and the next generation depends on mothers. And we're out here saying that it makes sense that mothers are underpaid. It's insanity. So I'm trying to do in my work, like not just exposing a lot of the data, but like being much more clear about what is actually happening here. Because if we're clear about that, then I don't think people would be so comfortable setting this aside and pretending, okay, we can deal with this some way, or like this kind of like incremental progress, which by the way, isn't even progress anymore. It's getting worse. Well, I guess that's like the next generation's problem. But I am the next generation, right? Like I talk about that in the book. I am the generation of girls who grew up on the idea that if we girl powered enough, if we were ambitious enough, we would succeed. And I'm 40 now, and I'm facing the same pay gaps as my mother, and fewer reproductive rights and fewer access to opportunities in some respects. So I think we should be more angry.
Yes, I agree with you. Now, you brought up parenting. So I'm curious to know, I have daughters. I have two daughters. Live in a biracial household, and when I see all of these systemic gaps and hurdles that we have to face, I start to question or wonder, like, how do I even have these conversations with them? Do I continue the lie of girl power all the way, our as Latina women say like échale ganas, just work harder? Or do I just tell them that the playing field isn't even? And I just teach them how to navigate them. So I'm curious to know, how do you navigate this conversation as a parent? Are you even having this conversation at home?
Well, my daughter's 2, so I'm certainly in a place where we're not necessarily having deep conversations. But what I will say I think about a lot, even at this stage, is what I model for my daughter. And what I really think about modeling for my daughter is what it means to be a mother, not as something that's entirely self sacrificial, not in terms of something that means I have no identity outside of my motherhood, or ambition outside of my motherhood. And certainly in terms of how my partner, my husband, and her father show up to parenting together and understand that that's a shared responsibility. I think that's incredibly essential. The data tells us it's essential. One of the best predictors of children's gender role attitudes and their outcomes is their parents' division of labor. Daughters of mothers who are in the paid labor force are much more likely to have higher earnings when they enter the paid labor force, are much more likely to marry egalitarian partners, and men who have engaged fathers who partake more in housework are also more likely to be more egalitarian partners when they become adults. So a lot of this is modeling, and a lot of what we show and what we teach about the world. And I think that's the conversation, is we don't fix these things by pretending they're not happening. I hate when people
Right.
are like, the answer is to be gender blind or race blind or whatever it is. Because again, that's something I expose in the book that really winds up just reinforcing the same kind of biases. People often use meritocracy basically as a synonym for bias while pretending the bias doesn't exist. So one example that I'll say that I see, I'll come back to the question, I promise. But one example is in a hiring experiment, they found that people were looking at a male application and a woman's application. And on the male's application, the guy had more experience and the woman had more education. And what they would do is not say, well, that we should hire the guy because he's a guy. They said, well, we should hire the guy because he has more experience. But in conditions where the situation was reversed and the woman had more experience and the guy had more education, they would say, well, we should hire the guy because he has more education. And so what they effectively did was shift the criteria of what it means to be merit worthy, of what it takes to
Mhm.
do a job well, to align with the identity of the person they really wanted to hire. So that comes up again and again and again in the research. Meritocracy is really a cover for that bias. And so I think this is something that like we teach our children because we see it every day. I
Yeah.
see it every day. As I'm shocked even now as a toddler how much people kind of gender my daughter and make assumptions about how she must be so different from her male peers, or what she should be able to do, or what she should be doing. Completely different. She's 2 years old. It's insane. And so I think we should call those things out as we encounter them, and we should be aware of what we model, because that's the best education. And that's not saying we're not working hard. It's not saying we don't think about how we're aligning with our values, but I do think it's important to be very honest about the way the payoffs of these things are disparate. And that's the work that changes things much more than trying to hustle harder.
Yes, 100%. My daughters are 6 and 8, but they already have a sense of, for example, money. Money
Yes.
conversations is super normalized at home. They already know about credit cards. They know about taxes. They know about interest rates. And I teach them,
Yes.
or they hear me talking about it with when I'm having conversations with my husband at the table about money, because for me that was really, really important to model. And when they hear me talking on the phone with clients about, like credit card or even negotiating salary, like for them, that has become so normalized. But most recently, I started to ask myself, like, oh, do I want them to know the realities of the world where we lived in, right? And the pay gap and the access for women, it's real everywhere globally. And so I wanted to take your take on what are you doing at home, just to kind of get like a, okay, let me be a fly on the wall and see if I can learn something from you. Now,
I mean, I will also say children are so observant. Like, they're going to have experiences where they're processing double standards very early, right? And I think there is a tendency when things are uncomfortable, like with money conversations, for other people, not in your case since you're an expert, but for other people, like they lean out of the discomfort. But I think we should lean into the discomfort. And if we can be curious about discomfort instead of saying something makes me uncomfortable and therefore I shouldn't talk about it, I think that's a really valuable skill.
I love that. Well, Stephanie, thank you so much for coming to the show. I want to open the floor for you to have an ask for our community. How can we support the work of the Ambition Penalty beyond purchasing a copy of it? Are you seeking a speaking engagement, corporate partners? Like, please ask away.
Thank you. Yeah, so certainly buying the book, sharing the book, reviewing the book wherever you bought it is incredibly helpful. But yes, I think these ideas are very important. I think it's really important to make sure that we're having them in conversations with people who have power, who can reshape these systems. So, yeah, speaking engagements, certainly corporate groups, but even book clubs, community groups, anything like that. I think I'm really trying to facilitate more and more of a redirecting or like a conversation or like a renewed urgency, because I think we're in a moment of real crisis. And I think a lot of people feel that and they don't know what to do. And I do think that a lot of this book will make you angry, but I think the anger is what we need.
After all of the research you've done, not just with the Ambition Penalty, but also as someone who has reported on personal finance for years, and you are an award winning journalist, what is your definition of wealth at this time?
Mm. At this time, I have to tell you honestly, like it's been a very challenging season for me as someone who both had a baby and wrote a book in an era of anti-feminist backlash, because that has become very something that people don't want to support. And I been like kind of going to my retirement accounts to just like look at, if I did nothing, what at this point in my life, like I'm 40, so for the next 25 years, what would those accounts be? And I just think to myself, oh my gosh, I am so grateful that I invested so much when I could, because it's really given me a lot of latitude to do this work that I think is important, to speak truth to power and take risks that have impacted me financially in a really meaningful way that I really wouldn't have been able to do otherwise. So, wealth is being able to certainly have the things that are good, and to be able to like have a kid, to live in New York City, to have the life that I do. But it's also about like being able to take a financial hit if it means what I think is doing the right thing.
I love that. Well, thank you so much for doing this work. I am a big fan, and I speak for myself and also for the community that listens to the Say Hola Wealth podcast, but you are welcome to return to the podcast.
Thank you.
And we will send connections for you. And thank you for writing such a powerful book for all women.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.